Well, welcome back, everyone. To those of you just joining us, welcome. My name is Adam Liff, and I teach at Indiana University and also direct 21 JPSI. As you can see on the slide, we are about to begin panel 2 of our 3-panel conference. And you can find a detailed breakdown of today's agenda, including speaker bios, on our conference webpage. Let me just post that link into the chat for everybody. All right, so far this morning, we've heard introductory remarks from Japan's Consul General in Chicago on the importance of Japan-US and Japan-Midwest relations. And that was followed by a panel of US-based experts to discuss the US-Japan alliance and geopolitical and geoeconomic issues in Northeast Asia. We are now launching into our second panel, which I have the pleasure of moderating. This panel brings together leading experts on Australia, France, Germany, the UK, and of course, Japan, to share their third-party perspectives on US-Japan relations and contemporary challenges in East Asia. Before I briefly introduce our expert lineup, let me just remind our audience how this session will work. The first half will be devoted to prepared remarks from each panelist of about 5 to 8 minutes each. About halfway through the session, we'll switch over to discussion and Q&A with all of you. Now, to ensure that we have plenty of time for that discussion and audience engagement, I would ask each of our panelists to please time themselves with a hard stop at 8 minutes. Thanks, guys. Now, to our audience, if you have a question, please submit it at any time during the event using the Q&A function. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen. We have a very large audience today, so apologies in advance if we're not able to get to all questions. Now, let me now introduce our panel. Leading us off today with perspective from Australia and the US-Australia Alliance will be Charlie Edel, who is the new Australia Chair and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Next, joining us to offer a German perspective will be Alexandra Sakaki, Deputy Head of the Asia Group at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And after Dr. Sakaki, we'll hear from Céline Pajon, Head of Japan Research at the French Institute of International Relations. And last but not least, we'll have Alessio Padolano, Security Director of the Japan Program at King's College London. Charlie, let me now turn things over to you to get things started. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Adam, and thanks very much to having me on to speak here. I've always wanted to come to Bloomington, so I guess this is the next best thing, and next time around we'll do it in person. Look, I also am very much in awe of your convening powers here, as the panel that we have is phenomenal, and I'm really honored to be on it. So I'm going to race through my comments so I can hear from my fellow panelists as much as is possible. As I understand it, we're supposed to focus on the variety of allies' views of the US-Japan alliance, how they think about it, how the relationship is similar, and how it is different. But let me note before that how close the Australian-Japan relationship has grown. This has been going on for some time. We know that Shinzo Abe visited Australia in 2014 and became the first Japanese leader to address the Australian Parliament. It was Japan and Australia, of course, who were largely responsible for salvaging TPP and making it into the TPP. And we have to look no further than this past January when Japan and Australia signed the Reciprocal Access Agreement, which is really a landmark agreement between the two countries. In fact, so important is this relationship that Japan was the first overseas trip Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison made during the pandemic, even though this required him to quarantine at home for 14 days after flying up to Tokyo. I highlight this for 3 different reasons. First, for Australia, Japan is the most important relationship it has after the United States in strategic terms. And I'd wager that's probably true in reverse as well, that after the US, Australia is rapidly becoming Japan's most important strategic partner. Second, the reason this is true, that Tokyo and Canberra now place so much weight on each other and have such lofty aspirations for what their partnership might become, is because over the past several years, the two countries have undergone a strategic convergence. And finally, that strategic convergence is largely driven by the increasingly aggressive use of China's military, economic, and diplomatic power. It's important to note that even if Australia and Japan have a similar set of concerns, there are key differences driven by geography and differences in their commercial relations with Beijing. But even so, because the challenge China poses does not look like it will change or abate, but rather intensify, the strategic convergence between Australia and Japan is only likely to grow. But despite that convergence, there are some interesting differences between the U.S. and Japan, Australia, and between Australia and Japan. First, in terms of trade, for the U.S., 8% of outbound trade goes to China. For Australia, it is 40% of outbound trade. Second, the shape of that trade is quite different. It is largely commodity driven, meaning that in the past, the Australians have been less concerned with issues such as IP theft. Another one is geography. Northeast Asia is important to Australians, but it's also somewhat far away. Things have been changing as not only the South China Sea, but the near abroad, the Pacific, Vanuatu, and other areas and locations look increasingly like areas of interest for the Chinese. And finally, in terms of domestic politics, I would say that until the last couple of years, defense spending has been somewhat low on the agenda in Australia. That has changed, but until about 2 to 3 years ago, there was an iterative debate about whether or not Australia would be a good ally, and that meant and was measured by whether or not they would send 2% of their GDP on defense. We are now at 2.5%, and we've been told that that is a floor, not a ceiling. So things have really rapidly changed. And I thought it might be useful to talk quickly about why things are changing so quickly. We know that they're changing around the region based on the perception of just how much of a challenge China has become. But I really think that that change in mentality has gone on faster in Australia and moved further than in almost any other place. And that has happened for a variety of reasons, everything from political interference into the Australian system, which not only the members of their government will talk about, but when we lived down there, our neighbors were fully cognizant of. I say that because popular outrage in some ways is driving politics there. But really, this is also a top-down decision because we might point to the Quad, we might point to AUKUS, but to understand these changes, you actually have to roll back the clock a little bit to July 2020. Now, July 2020, ancient history, we were only 6 months into the pandemic, but Australia released its Defense Strategic Update. It was seen as really a revolution in how they thought about their defense. The Prime Minister said they were going to spend $270 billion Australian over the next 10 years. That's a 6% increase in their defense spending. And note, and that is 6 months into the pandemic, when every democracy in the world is thinking about domestic resilience, and yet their prime minister calls for an increase in capabilities. And the reason that they did that is because he made public statements about this at the time. He thought that the strategic environment had changed not only so rapidly, but more rapidly than anyone had predicted, that Australia had to adjust and change with it if it were to have any agency in its own region. The Defense Strategic Update basically said that with the huge outlay of money that China has invested into its defense capabilities, Australia needed to reorient, spend more money, acquire more advanced and more lethal capabilities, and become more geographically circumscribed. Less focus in the future on safeguarding lines of communication to the Middle East, less expeditionary forces, more local focus on what was happening to their north. Everything else that follows flows from that. Quad, reinvigoration, AUKUS in particular, and we're now seeing the beginnings of a strike debate within Australia. $1 billion has already been promised by the Prime Minister. The estimates vary widely. I've read anywhere from 100 to $200 billion Australian will probably go into the production of a strike enterprise within the next 10 years. It's a lot of cash. I would note, too, that as we talk about this, a couple of final thoughts for you, one on politics, one on strategy. So the first one on domestic politics is that Australia has an election coming up. It's going to be in April or May this year. Australian politics is a blood sport, and it's becoming bloodier if you are watching the Australian press. But do not miss the main point that on the large issues, despite the political differences that are now being made, there is a strategic convergence between both parties that they need to do more, not less, in their region and with others. Second point, strategic. Australia and Japan are very different countries with very different histories. And yet we are seeing the same issues beginning to be debated. What more offensive capabilities might look like, what a better economic coalition might begin to look like, and frankly, what diplomacy and more robust diplomacy with each other and with others in and outside the region looks like. And so I would just conclude with comments from Shingo Yamagami, who is Japan's ambassador to Canberra, who has said consistently, his one public message that he said in public and in private since he got there in late 2020, which is to Australia, you are not walking alone. This obviously refers to the difficulties that both nations have had with China, but is also, I think, aspirational as both states grope their way forward to how to build collective resolve, resilience, and capacity.
All right, thank you, Charlie. Covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. Thank you. We now will zoom across the Atlantic Ocean to Alexandra Sakaki. Alexandra, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Adam, and your team for organizing this exciting conference and for inviting me. I will focus my comments and start here from the German-Japanese bilateral relationship, and then at the end of the talk come to the U.S. Japan alliance. The Germany and Japan are two countries that are clearly very important partners for the US, although I'm aware of discussions in the US about German reliability as an ally in the Ukraine crisis. But putting that aside, Germany and Japan are hosting the largest US troop contingents in their respective region, and they also wield significant global influence due to their economies, as well as through membership in such formats as the Group of Seven. So based on that recognition that Germany and Japan are key allies for the US, I want to address their mutual relationship and make 3 points. The first point is on the state of the relationship between Germany and Japan, and I would entitle that Changes in the Air. If we look at the bilateral ties between Germany and Japan until quite recently, we would find that relations have been good and cooperative, but they've also been lacking somewhat in substance and depth in many policy fields. There's a number of reasons for that I cannot go into detail about now, but certainly the fact that both countries have defined themselves largely as regional powers in their neighborhoods has meant that there's a lack of strong overlap in foreign policy priorities between Germany and Japan. However, the bilateral ties seem to be moving towards more engagement. And even if that trend is only emerging now, I think it is a trend that the United States should not overlook, because Washington stands to benefit from it. So in how far are relations between Germany and Japan moving forward? First of all, we see more high-level exchanges between the two sides, so more frequent ministerial exchanges. And in particular, in 2021, the two sides had their first 2+2 meeting between foreign and defense ministers. And I think this trend will continue under the new German government of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who came into office in December. His coalition government has announced plans to hold cabinet-level consultations with Japan, which signals an upgrading by Germany of the relationship with Japan. We also see notable steps in the security fields between Germany and Japan. So the two countries have signed agreements on intelligence sharing, as well as on development of new defense technology. And as some of you may know, Germany also deployed a German frigate to the Indo-Pacific. It actually just returned today to Germany. And this has also been used to deepen relations with Japan through consultations and also a series of joint exercises, which is an important development given that the fact that both sides' military forces have had only limited contact until now. In fact, the frigate actually took part in a 10-day joint exercise with Japan, the US, Australia, and Canada in the Philippine Sea. And this, I think, was the first time that Germany engaged in an exercise with both Japan and the US in the Indo-Pacific region. The second point I'd like to make is the context and motivation of that change of Germany turning more towards Japan. So I think Germany's engagement with Japan is driven forward as part of Germany's broader Indo-Pacific policy engagement. Actually, in September 2020, Germany issued for the first time guidelines on the Indo-Pacific and Indo-Pacific policy. And according to those guidelines, Germany seeks to diversify and deepen relations with many partners, among them Japan. Those guidelines are based on the recognition of the Indo-Pacific as an economically important region, and also a region that is consequential for the future of the international rules-based order. So against that background, Germany no longer wants to be a bystander to the dynamics in that region. The guidelines, I would say, certainly represent a reassessment of China in Germany. So policymakers here now do recognize China as a key challenge, particularly its disregard for international law and assertive foreign policy tactics that have affected even Europe. But on the other hand, Germany's approach to China, I would say, is very cautious, not to polarize the region by targeting China directly, which is maybe different from the US and to some extent also different from Japan. So while views between Germany and the US and Japan, on the other hand, may be somewhat different how to approach China, I do think there's more willingness in Berlin now to consult with Japan and also the US on how to deal with China, which I guess should be good news for the US. The final point I would make is on the relevance of these developments for the US-Japan alliance. Now, critics are quick to point out the limits of German or a European role in the Indo-Pacific. And I think 2 points are often made. One is that Germany and even the broader European powers do not have the military power resources to really make a difference in the balance of military power in the Indo-Pacific. And the other is that from a US perspective, Europe is also perhaps not in line with Washington on China. Now, while both of those may to some extent be true, that I think does not mean that German and European engagement is insignificant for the US. First of all, I think the more Europeans engage with the region, the more they increase their awareness of regional dynamics. And this, I think, will in turn lead to Europe taking a clearer stance on issues of concern to the US-Japan alliance, such as, for example, the case of Taiwan, as Adam mentioned in session 1. So we've had the EU-Japan summit meeting in May 2021 that for the first time mentioned the importance of stability in the Taiwan Straits. And such statements clearly express European interest in stability in the region and also to some extent can complicate China's strategic calculus. Secondly, I would say we also have to take a broader perspective. The US, along with European and Asian allies, face similar threats and tactics from China and Russia, both of which use, for example, cyber threats, disinformation campaigns, and great gray zone tactics between peace and war. And so I think it would be useful to have discussions and devise common approaches to these challenges and also come to common understandings on how to deal with the growing cooperation between Russia and China, which was already mentioned by previous speakers. I'll stop my remarks here and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. All right, now we're moving a little bit, well, next to Germany on the European continent. Celine, over to you whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your invitation, Adam. It's a great pleasure to be here and see familiar and friendly faces all around. So I will actually talk along what Alexandra just said, and starting by the France-Japan relations. And I see already there is a question on this in the Q&A. So I will start by this, and then look at the alliance. We start by saying that for decades, the Franco-Japanese partnership has essentially been characterized by dynamic cultural exchanges and economic relations. And so today, Japan is France's second largest trading partner in Asia after China, and it's its leading Asian investor. There is no major point of friction in the relation, and then a partnership of exception was set up in 2013. And since then, we have seen coordination on strategic affairs with an annual foreign and defense minister meeting, the 2+2 meeting. And I think that the two countries, adoption of Indo-Pacific strategy have been providing a new kind of motivation, impetus to develop the bilateral security cooperation. And as you may know, France announced its own Indo-Pacific strategy back in 2018. And its approach actually shares a lot with Japan. First, they have both have a broad kind of geographical definition of the Indo-Pacific, from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific coast of the US. They both share a kind of priority to uphold a rules-based order in the region, especially at sea. So there is a very big focus on the maritime security, and they also try to maintain the overall stability of the region. Of course, checking China's inappropriate moves, behaviors, preventing China's predominance or domination in the region, and also achieving a kind of level playing field with Beijing by networking with partners is also a common goal between France and Japan, and should be recognized. Overall, I would agree what has been said about the convergence, the clear convergence in terms of threat assessment in recent years regarding China as a security and systemic risk by France and Japan. We've seen that, especially as Charles explained, there has been an acceleration, no doubt, since the pandemic. We've seen a very much assertive diplomatic stance from China, and we know that Beijing continued to advance in the sea, East China Sea, South China Sea, in Hong Kong and so on, without stopping during the pandemic. So it really deteriorated the China's image in Europe and in France. And so quite naturally, Japan, along with India and Australia, has been considered as key partner for France to implement its Indo-Pacific strategy, especially in terms of maritime security. And then the security cooperation has expanded and gradually been institutionalized. So we've seen an agreement on the transfer of defense equipment and technology back in 2016, and this allowed for a joint research and development of a new generation of underwater minesweeping technologies. In 2018, we've seen an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement that was signed to allow the sharing of defense supplies and services, and it's also an important step in expanding cooperation, and over time to move on to more ambitious joint exercise, either bilaterally or with partners. And to give you a flavor of what's going on, I will refer to the last year so-called ARC 21 exercise. For the first time, we saw some French forces operating on Japanese soil, Japanese territory, along with the US forces and the Australian for amphibious drill. And the aim was to improve the interoperability in case of the defense of a remote island. That was the scenario that was developed at that time. So you can see that there is a kind of message behind behind the scenario. Before that, an anti-submarine warfare exercise also took place between France, Japan, and the US in December 2020. So as you see, for France, it's quite important to work with Japan because it's really a kind of like-minded, great maritime power that is really keen interest in sustaining maritime security. And the fact that Japan is also a key US ally is also important. Paris really recognized the value of the Japan-US alliance as a stabilizing factor in the Northeast Asia and more broadly in the Indo-Pacific. And even after AUKUS, which was really a shock, for France, I believe that Paris and Washington puts a lot of effort to restore trust and ensure a better coordination to try to prevent any future kind of bad surprise like that. And now there is the clear US recognition of the strategic importance of the European engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So that's a very good point. This said, I have to highlight some differences in approaches between France and the US in the Indo-Pacific, and especially regarding China. Of course, the US has so far been quite confrontational, while France and European in general, as Alexandra said, are rather trying to shape a positive regional environment, either to engage China or to discourage inappropriate moves, rather than trying to contain Beijing. In addition, Paris sees the growing Sino-US competition as a destabilizing factor and wants to keep some autonomy, strategic autonomy. So this is not at all a kind of equidistant policy between Washington and Beijing, as you know, but it's rather about being able to act on its own when interests do not align with the US. But there is no doubt that we are close allies with the US and we share fundamental values and interests. This difference, I think they call for more dialogue and coordination for sure. And this is already happening, but they do not prevent cooperation. I think quite the contrary. There are really plenty of room to coordinate initiative, work in synergy or complementarity in different settings. Since last September, we have been talking a lot about AUKUS, but not all is about AUKUS. There's a lot of different minilaterals, multilaterals, and so on initiative. And there are also now some opening from Europe to work with the Quad at some point, maybe on non-traditional security matter first, and then we'll see if possible to expand. I feel also that the new US Indo-Pacific strategy seems to be more convergent with the European approach, at least on the paper. It's talking a lot about coordinating with partners, ensuring independence of choices of regional countries and providing common goods for the region. So this should make cooperation also easier. Even if I think France will want to keep a kind of specific European approach to the region. And as you may know, next week on February 22, we have a European Ministerial Summit on the Indo-Pacific with a lot of partners from the region, but not the US nor China are invited. So what would be the way forward? I believe that France will continue to move ahead with its Indo-Pacific strategy in a more comprehensive way, not only on security issue. We're talking a lot about the naval dispatch by France, but other issues like connectivity, environment, economic security are very important. And on this, Paris will articulate its approach much more within the EU's one. And I think this will also provide more ground for cooperation with Europe and coordination with the US. And I will end up here. Thank you.
Thank you, Celine. Now we head across the channel to London, and Alessio, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Adam. We're literally leaving European shores now in more ways than one. First of all, thank you so much for the kind invitation, and thank you, Adam, and your wonderful team for organizing these events. If anything, when I was given the essay question of how does the sort of US-Japan alliance look like seen from the UK? If anything, this panel and the fact that we all know each other, we've all known each other for quite some time, is symptomatic of the answer. The US-Japan alliance brought us together, and today is one of the launching pads of this international dialogue and conversation. And that's pretty much really the bottom line of the argument of my remarks. I have 3 points in 6 minutes, and I'm starting counting as now. So Adam, you can hold me to account on that. From the UK, I think there's the 3 points that are worth making when we're looking at the meaning of US-Japan alliance. One is about a changing world vision, a worldview, and the vision about the international geopolitics. From the UK, the year 2021 marked the end of 20 years in which the counterinsurgency fight in Central Asia was drawn to a close. And with the publication of the Integrated Review, you have an official sort of moving of the key structural challenges in international relations back on state gauging, with obviously a focus on Russia, but also a clear statement that China represented the geopolitical challenge over the next couple of decades. So in this respect, I think there is a lot of broader strategic convergence, this idea that there is a shared worldview that brings the US-Japan, where the US-Japan alliance is coming, and where the US-Japan alliance has been a source, if you want, of interesting conversations between Japan and the UK, when these two elements did not really quite align until a couple of years ago. In particular, from that unfolds two observations. One, a convergence between the UK and Japan in the context of this worldview, that maritime connectivity stands at the heart of why the Indo-Pacific matters internationally, and why it matters to Japan and it matters to the UK. And here maritime connectivity is both physical and digital. Physical in terms of the shipping lanes that provides goods and resources the world over, and digital based on the submarine cables that provide the hardcore wiring of present and future digital economies, including financial services. And the second element, it raised a very interesting question in a way that it's never really come to the fore. And this is a point that Jeffrey mentioned earlier on in the Q&A about how and to what extent the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic spaces, the geopolitical spaces, given the nature of the challenges of today, are connected. How do you connect them together? How do we cooperate? And that's really very much about the extent to which we link the Russia and China element together, which oddly enough is seen from the UK, started really with the June incident of 2016, when the Russian task group heading towards back from the exercise really gave the first indication of things to come in terms of where we are today in that development. This naturally leads to the second point that I want to touch upon today, and that is agency. From the UK, the US-Japan alliance of the last, basically the end of the Obama administration onwards, is very much about the empowerment of medium powers like Japan and the UK, with global interests in the international system, and the sense of agency and role that they have. Now, of course, with the Trump administration, that became most of a requirement, but certainly it turns out to be an absolute asset. And in that sense, the alliance changed from being something that is designed just to ensure the defense of Japan, and it became more of a launching pad for how Japan manifested itself as an agent, as a security actor in the Indo-Pacific, and how that enabled Japan to strengthen and expand the conversation with other actors in a similar position, most notably the UK, and certainly also France and Germany, as it's been mentioned. Here I want to touch upon two particular elements. One, the comeback of multilateral diplomacy and what I've defined as realpolitik minilateralism, the use of small formation to sort of tackle specific issues. And I'll start with the Australia-US-Japan trilateral, which, as Charlie mentioned, was very important in terms of showcasing that Japan wanted to explore options beyond, from within the US-Japan alliance umbrella, but beyond also, and bringing other actors in, which quickly extended to the UK. And in a way, it inspired also some of the UK actions, the last one of which being AUKUS and how it manifested 6 months ago. So in this respect, what is interesting is also how it is changing Japan in that sense, and this is my second point in this context, as a security actor and one that explores opportunities for interoperability and cooperation to new depth with actors other than just the United States in ways that was just unprecedented. The RRA with Australia is a good example. Thank God they've done it, because the UK was in the queue to get its own RRA with Japan, and it's in lawmaking, and this is something that hopefully will come to terms. But the practical implication of this, we're seeing already on a daily basis. HMS Tama, which is one of the 2 OPVs forward deployed in the region, entered the port of Yokosuka just on the back of last week conducting ship-to-ship transfer monitoring in the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea. So this is something real and something that we've seen last year as well with the deployment of CSG-21, the Category Strike Group, which is the largest display of European firepower in more than one generation, all in one go. And this leads, however, to my third point, from agency to the place where perhaps the US-Japan alliance, and in particular Japan's role in it, strikes a particularly important chord with the way the UK sees international security and the foundations, the core elements. And that is about prosperity, how prosperity fits into this bigger picture, and prosperity needs to be the propelling engine underpinning security considerations, political consideration, providing a vision. The Free and Open Indo-Pacific Initiative was at heart a tool to create prosperity. Prosperity is very much something that from an economic point of view stands at the heart of what the UK is trying to do with its own Indo-Pacific tilt. It is not a coincidence that it is under Japan chairmanship that CPTPP application of the UK was processed and moved forward and is now coming to a successful conclusion. And it really encompasses this idea of how prosperity, particularly in the context of the frameworks that drive prosperity, how we get about it, and some key new technologies that will inform it, the digital space, are going to be a particularly important element of the conversation. And in that sense, there is a clear sense of convergence that through and from within the US-Japan alliance, these new opportunities have been created. And certainly within the context of the UK-Japan cooperation, these elements have been recognized and pushed forward. So to conclude, what does this all mean? Or what is the one point to take away when we're looking, sitting here in London, a very stormy London, what is happening in the US-Japan alliance? It's very much about maturity and how the alliance has enabled Japan to mature as a security actor, increasing its own agency in political, economic, and security initiative, but also to start thinking about the implications and the consequences of wanting to be a security actor just beyond that US-Japan alliance umbrella. But at the same time, I think it's been very important to see the US confidence in a way that did not exist before in empowering Japan and its other allies to work with each other, and in some cases to bring them even closer together. Now, of course, within all of this, despite all the great good of my Italian genes to see the positive in everything in life, there are a couple of limitations, because, of course, when it comes to greater security cooperation, one of the outstanding questions is how far will it go? How far will Japan be wanting to go in terms of pushing that interoperability that will require domestic audiences to engage with other forces from other countries to be visible and familiar faces across the country? How far will it go for the United States to accept that Japan might pursue capabilities development cooperation with countries other than the United States or just the United States? These are very important questions and the one that I look forward to discussing with you. And that's my 8 minutes and 10 seconds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessio. What a wonderful panel. The 4 of you covered a remarkable amount of ground in a very short time. There's a lot that I'd like to ask in so little time. So I sincerely hope that we can continue the conversation sometime in the near future, hopefully in person, if that's ever possible. But what I'd like to do is start a question, start our discussion with a question to each of our panelists, and then we'll try to squeeze in a question or two from our audience. So audience members, if you have a question, now is the time to submit it through the Q&A function. I'm seeing that some of the questions coming in overlap a bit with what I'd like to ask, so I'll try to merge as much as possible. So Charlie, if I could ask you a question first, and it's a question with two parts. So you talked about how Australia-Japan security ties have really deepened significantly in recent years. And from your vantage point, what do you see as, at least today, the upper bound on where that deepening security cooperation could lead? Do you think the limit exists entirely on the Japanese side, or are there also political constraints in Canberra that maybe don't get too much attention, which it would be good for an American and global audience to better understand? For example, perhaps there are some within Canberra concerned about how China might react, or some other factor. If you could share your views on that, that would be wonderful. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for the easy question, which goes straight at the heart of the challenges that Alessio posed at the end of his about what are the bounds of our cooperation. So I don't have a precise answer, because I think that Australian national security and foreign policy writ large has gone into overdrive a bit over the past year and a half, but even more precisely over the last 4 months. We might focus on the reciprocal access agreement, we might focus on AUKUS, but that misses all that Australia has done. Even over the last 3 months, working for their first import of tanks from the South Koreans, which the Australians are very open about as that wanting to be not so much tanks, but technological collaboration. Their free trade agreement with Britain that was just signed. Their work to put peacekeeping forces up in the Solomon Islands before the Chinese got their peacekeepers there. And of course, the funding of digital cables running up to some of the Pacific Islands. That there's a bevy of things that are going on right now. And I would say that I'm not sure I yet see limits to how far we might go here, because I would know first that Scott Morrison, when he came into office, said that he actually thought of Shinzo Abe as his mentor in terms of foreign policy. He said this in an interview. And if we look at the kind of hyperactivity of Australian foreign policy, I think it very much follows the Japanese model that we saw from maybe 6-7 years ago. And not only big muscle movement between alliance growth bilaterally, but also what they are doing on their own independent of the United States. So Australian Japan cooperation, I think there's lots further to go and to push there. More specifically, though, your question, Adam, about what might be some wariness and limits. Look, there is always a pushback, a calibration about, as we heard discussed by both Alexandra and Celine about how much of this is affirmative, how much should you be poking the dragon? There are elements of that certainly in Australia, and tempering voices too. We have an election. If you have the Labour Party, which is in opposition, winning, I do not see them pulling back. They simply say that they want to do things smarter and pay more attention to the Pacific Islands and work more collaboratively with their European partners. Now, they haven't fleshed in exactly what that means, and I think they wouldn't until they're actually in government. But in terms of limitations, no, I think it's seen at this point as a win-win to continue doubling down on that Japanese relationship, because it helps to anchor them into the region. And the one area for growth particularly that I'd point to is the Australians are particularly cognizant of just how good Japan's reputation is in Southeast Asia. And I think they see that as a growth area for them, that they do not want to be relegated to only talking about the Pacific and want to have more of an action plan for Southeast Asia. But of course, that requires more resources from them and beyond just their partnership with Jakarta.
Thank you, Charlie. Next, Alexandra, as you noted and as was discussed briefly in the first panel, one really remarkable development of the last year was this proliferation of statements of concern about peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait among U.S. democratic allies, including at the G7. Could I ask you to share with us your sense of the contours of the debate concerning Taiwan within Berlin these days? As in most countries, my understanding is that Germany has some outspoken politicians on these issues. I follow some of them on Twitter. But could you share with us your sense of where you think the current administration is and whether we might see any further movement beyond that statement to actual policy shifts? Thank you.
Sure, thanks for this question. So it's quite interesting. People, have studied in detail the coalition agreement of the new government. And one of the things that came up is that it mentions, I think for the first time in history, Taiwan specifically, and it talks about the importance of stability in the Taiwan Straits. So clearly this signals somewhat of a greater support to Taiwan from Germany. On the other hand, I think, the whole question of how to deal with Taiwan again comes back to this problem of how much to push back against China. I think there's different views. Actually, if you look below the surface of this coalition government, it's a three-party coalition government. And if you look below the surface, you'll find different perspectives on how to engage with China and also what that means for Taiwan policy. So I think the smaller coalition partners, the Liberals and the Greens, they have more or less stated quite strong support for Taiwan to engage more with Taiwan below kind of the highest level of ministers. So there's very strong support there. On the other hand, we have the SPD party, which is Olaf Scholz's party. And I think in that party, the views are kind of split. There's part of the party is in favor of, a stronger pushback against China. And that means also more support for Taiwan. On the other hand, you have certainly a very vocal part of this party that calls for a focus on diplomacy, on dialogue with countries like China, but also with Russia. We see it in the Ukraine crisis now, which is a big division within the party. And how this plays out will be quite interesting. China policy in Germany has been driven very much by the chancellery. So actually the way the chancellor will position himself on this issue will be quite important. I think it's still an open question. We see in the European Parliament, for example, we see very strong support for closer relations with Taiwan. And against the background of China's pushback against Lithuania, I think also the debate again is being invigorated. And I do think that there's an active discussion, but the exact result is still open, I guess.
Right, thank you. Very complicated issues, and every country has their own domestic politics as well. Thank you, Alexandra. So for Celine and Alessio, I'd like to ask you both the same question, but to ask you to respond from the perspective of France and the UK, respectively. And the question builds off both some of your remarks, but also a question that's come in from the audience. How do you think policymakers in the US should understand and interpret the seriousness of France's and the UK's ambitions to deepen strategic ties with Japan and play a greater role in the Indo-Pacific more generally, be it 2+2s or defense tech cooperation agreements? These agreements, these signings, these high-level meetings get a lot of media attention, but I think some people might wonder, is it best to understand them as primarily symbolic, especially given geography and ongoing challenges in Eastern Europe? Or do you think that they're the beginning of major changes, major deepening of practical and practically significant ties? Celine, could you answer first, please?
Well, I will try, at least. No, I think it's that it's already a significant progress if you look at, you know, from where we stood in the Franco-Japanese relation back in 2008, for example, when I started to work on this in France. There's been almost no interest in Japan, and I really saw the interest, you know, growing and moving along with the Abe administration actually proactive stance on the international scene and the reforms that he implemented on the defense sphere. So I think it's the interest of France to deepen the security relation with Japan is really serious. It has been going on for years. So maybe you can find it quite modest if you compare with the degree of interoperability with the US and so on, but we are not in the same part of the world, obviously. So we have still a different way to look at what's going on in the region. So even when we take into account this very strong convergence now of views regarding the challenges, and especially the China challenges, that's quite natural that you see some difference at least. But I think that it will go on. I think that now the objective for France and Japan is to discuss a reciprocal access agreement, as Australia did. So that's not so easy. It took 6 years for Australia. So you know. More, okay, 7. So you see, things are taking time because of it's Japan too, but we have clearly converging interest in terms of industrial, defense equipment and industrial cooperation. There might be some frustration from the French side because the Japan is still very much attached to the US, but still there is a modest cooperation ongoing, and Japan is also more and more interested to step up its engagement in the Pacific and South Pacific region. And as you know, France has forces there and has a lot of states also. So I believe that the cooperation will also grow. Japan already announced that it will open a consulate in Nouméa in New Caledonia. So not only on the hard security issue, but looking at more scientific cooperation regarding ocean seabeds and so on. So we need to have a broader look at the partnership, but it's certainly serious, and it's certainly taking some progress.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting space to watch. Alessio, sir, over to you.
Thank you so much. So I'll be radical on this one. First of all, in 3 ways. Number one, I think the European voice is a general proposition, but perhaps insofar as the UK is concerned, is quite remarkable. It is a missing voice in DC. If you look at, since the publication of the Integrated Review, how many articles have been published in the DC think tank community about the UK tilt? 3. And so that's, when you cannot feel one single hand, it means that either there is no interest there, or there is a lack of understanding. So I think the first thing to do when we're talking about how the US should understand, I think there is a need to change somewhat the dynamics of interactions of the established patterns. The same way you want in Japan to change the establishment of the patterns of communication with the Europeans, as in like, oh, listen to what we have to say about China, but we're not really sure we want to listen to what you have to say about Russia. You have to change that. The same thing in transatlantic relations, you have to start going beyond this idea, oh, but Europe is far away from Asia. No, it isn't. A nuclear submarine under the water of the polar region can strike any European capital, the same it can do it from the Indian Ocean. And as we look forward to continuing to have this conversation that Russia is our problem, it just doesn't work like that. So we need to start changing those established pattern of dynamics. In Europe, there is expertise on Asia. It's a long-standing expertise. We might come with a different view. We don't have the same amount of global presence that the United States has, but that should not be reflected in how we conduct our conversation. So that's why these type of conferences are so important. And in fact, Adam, are a rarity, right? Because, look back a couple of years ago, nothing like that would be in place, or people just show up. It's like, why do we have to care about what the Europeans think about Asia, frankly? So, and as someone who's done this for a very long time, I speak out of experience. So point number one, we need to change and start giving a voice. Because in Europe, there is a US voice about all sorts of things, including Asia. I don't think that is the case in the United States and certainly in DC. The second thing is the broader point about this idea that there is a distribution of labor. We focus on the Euro-Atlantic and United States, Japan, and other partners focus on the Indo-Pacific. That's not true. That's not the case. Otherwise, the UK would have not jumped on the AUKUS opportunity and it would be committed to it. And it would be committed to have produced an Indo-Pacific tilt as part of its integrated review, given the fact that we do have very tiny territories in Indo-Pacific, but unlike France, we're not an Indo-Pacific state. For us, the Indo-Pacific is important strategically for two reasons, and that goes to my third point. It should be taken seriously because if there's one thing that matters, and in this case, the UK is very similar to Japan, the relationship with the United States is a fundamental pillar of UK foreign and security policy. And we get the message that in DC, China is important, is the bigger deal compared to Russia. Therefore, we take the Indo-Pacific in that respect at the structural level of international relations very seriously. And we are seriously committed to find a common way with the United States and our partners to ensure that US-UK relations remains a core pillar of our security policy. And the second dimension of this is the meaning that the Indo-Pacific has as a post-Brexit re-engineering of Britain's international profile, whether it is on matters of trade, whether it is on matters of international order. And for the UK, it matters. The UK, like France, is a permanent member of the Security Council. It has an international stake in the maritime order, in the shaping of the digital order. We've been there every single time a major international ordering process was in place. The UK was at the shaping table. These things do matter. In the Indo-Pacific, there is a recognition in this country that is significant, not just the region is in its own terms, but the impact it is likely to have on how the world looks in 20 years' time. So in that sense, whether it is trade, whether it is international order, whether it is strategic issues, the commitment is serious. That doesn't necessarily translate into a reorientation of massive resources, but it does mean, however, that we will be engaging increasingly more with our partners, not just the United States, but Australia, Japan, South Korea, precisely because we recognize that our game is in the convening power that the UK has internationally and how we can convene that even with limited resources. And the question really becomes learning through conversations with our partners what the best ways to apply these resources are. That is the key conversation. But unless our voice starts becoming a thing that matters in places like DC, all of this will always be hampered at the end of the day. Over.
Thank you, Alessio. And I think one thing that's also important to recognize is that a lot of the challenges that the US and Japan face today are not geographically based. They occur in the cyber domain. It's about space, it's about information. And in this regard in particular, the fact that Europe is where Europe is doesn't matter nearly as much. And I think that's something in the years ahead that we all need to factor into our discussion. Well, we are basically at the end of our time. This has been a very robust discussion. And I just, Charlie wanted to get in on one particular topic that I had raised earlier. And so, Charlie, I'd like to turn things over to you. There's something you wanted to comment on as it concerns Taiwan and Australia, is that right? And you'll get the last word before we close up.
That's overly generous of you, Adam, and thank you all for such a great exchange. So because we're going to close here, let me make sure that I throw in a provocation to end us with. We have been debating about what the situation in Ukraine means for America's Asia focus. And I think we are debating the wrong question. The question that I think is so relevant to all of our countries' capitals is if we had had more advanced warning of what Russia was going to do, what would we have wanted Ukraine to have had in place? And so that, to me, is the very clear and obvious lesson that we are all taking and should take for those of us who watch the Indo-Pacific. If we had clear and advanced warning on what China's intentions were with regard to Taiwan, what would we want to have in place before that happened? And that strikes me as that's the objective. So how do we work backwards and accelerate that work together at this point?
Well, thank you very much. Good, a provocation, a lot to think about. And I look forward to discussing these and other issues with all of you in the coming months and years. So we are at time. We are ending on time, which is always a nice thing to do. So I'd just like to end by thanking all of you for attending our panel, and of course to our wonderful panelists. This has really been a very robust discussion. We'll take about a 10-minute break before our final panel will begin at 1:20 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. Again, that's in about 10 minutes for those of you in different time zones. That final panel will focus on domestic policy challenges in U.S.-Japan relations and will be moderated by Hilary Holbrow, my colleague, and another 21 JPSI faculty affiliate at the Hamilton Lugar School. So thank you all again. Please don't go anywhere. We'll be back in just 10 minutes.